At the U.S. Capitol, in a live hearing streamed across 50 states, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts conservative firebrand Candace Owens over the dangerous rise of weaponized disinformation. Owens insists she's being silenced for asking uncomfortable questions, but just minutes later, Crockett flips the narrative with financial records, whistleblower testimony, and a leaked recording that shatters Owens' defense. As the chamber erupts and the world watches live, one question slices through the silence. If outrage can be manufactured for profit, how many lives have already paid the cost? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber had never been this charged. Beneath the gold eagle crest of the U.S. Capitol, the special congressional hearing on disinformation in the post-truth era was called to order. There were no pleasantries, no applause, just a thick, electric silence, like the calm before a political execution. Seated in the center of the grand hearing room, Candace Owens, media firebrand and cultural agitator, was poised at the witness table, her expression steeled with defiance. She had been invited not as a criminal, but as a distinguished influencer in media to speak on behalf of freedom of expression. But everyone in the room knew this was no tribute. It was a trap being set with precision. Across from her, seated high behind the oak dais, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, now chairing the committee with unshakable poise. Her gavel rested untouched. Her files were already open. Her posture was calm, but her eyes were loaded with intent. She wasn't here to play politics. She was here to interrogate power. Crockett was flanked by aides, legal advisors, and two massive LED panels already synced to incoming data. Her voice hadn't spoken a word yet, but the tension she carried was louder than thunder. Owen sat back in her seat, legs crossed, defiant smile drawn tight across her face like armor. But even she couldn't ignore the quiet shifting of the atmosphere. Something in the room had changed. This wasn't the soft platform she was used to. This was Capitol Hill under full exposure. No scripts, no cuts, no edits. And across from her sat the one woman she couldn't out-talk, out-shout, or outsmart. No one in the room could have predicted what was about to unfold, but in less than an hour, an empire built on outrage would start to crack, and Candace Owens wouldn't see it coming. But just as the air thickened with anticipation, it wasn't the committee that struck first. It was Candace Owens, who leaned into the microphone not to defend herself, but to ignite a firestorm before a single question could be asked. Her voice didn't tremble. It surged, calculated, cold and laced with fury masked as righteousness. "What's happening here today isn't justice," she declared, her eyes sweeping the room like a predator stalking familiar territory. "It's punishment." She didn't wait for a prompt. She didn't acknowledge the chair. She launched forward with a clarity honed over years of talk shows, online tirades, and headlines engineered to provoke. The truth is simple. The United States government, the mainstream media, and the tech empires that control your news feeds, they don't want people like me speaking freely, not because I lie, not because I manipulate, but because I refuse to submit. She let the silence hang before detonating the next line like a grenade. "I am a black woman who dares to think differently, and for that, they'd rather burn me at the stake than let me speak at the table." She said it not with fear, but with practiced venom, an indictment aimed at everyone in the room and everyone watching across the country. She turned her body toward the cameras now, abandoning the committee altogether. "I ask questions. Dangerous ones? Yes, but only dangerous to the people who benefit from silence." Her words oozed with moral superiority, each syllable delivered with the cadence of a viral clip waiting to explode across social media. "They hate that I shine a light where they prefer shadows. They hate that I'm not on their leash. And most of all, they hate that I do it while black." She leaned back slowly in her chair, arms folded, gaze unblinking. "So don't confuse this hearing for accountability. This is retaliation. This is what it looks like when the establishment realizes it can't control the narrative anymore." For a moment, the room was paralyzed. The audience, a sea of political aides, press corps, and victims of misinformation, absorbed the speech like a slap. And yet, in the middle of the chaos she was trying to conjure, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't even blink. Instead, she calmly slid her pen across a notepad with surgeon-like precision, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable. She made a single check mark beside a bullet point on the page, then gently nodded, as if confirming something she already knew would happen. No rebuttal, no confrontation, just a nod. And in that moment, her silence pierced louder than Owens's entire monologue. The audience felt it, tensely, viscerally, that Jasmine wasn't threatened, that she wasn't rattled, that this entire outburst had been anticipated. Owens had come into the hearing chamber believing she could twist the narrative in her favor with sound bites and firebrand theatrics. But Crockett had brought something else entirely, an arsenal of restraint, timing, and facts still hidden beneath sealed folders and flickering screens. The silence that followed Owens's rant wasn't weakness. It was the sound of a blade being drawn in the shadows, calm, quiet, and mercilessly deliberate. And though Candace Owens had the floor, what she didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett had already taken the room. She had claimed to be the victim of censorship, the rebel with no backers, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't chasing feelings. She was chasing funding, and now the numbers were ready to speak. Jasmine Crockett moved with a stillness that made the room lean in, not out. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She simply reached for the small black remote resting beside her binder, clicked once, and turned toward the screen behind her with surgical timing. The lights dimmed by a fraction, just enough for the white text on the digital display to sear into the eyes of everyone watching. At the top of the slide, the words, Candace Owens, Undisclosed Income, 2022 to 2024. And beneath it, a single, unignorable figure, $10,271,893. Jasmine let the silence do the heavy lifting for a beat before speaking. That, she began with calm precision, is how much Miss Owens has received from untraceable entities, many of which have no visible board, no stated mission, and no tax records. She let her eyes sweep the room slowly. Meanwhile, her media output during that same period spiked by 146%. Coincidentally, right as disinformation about public health, election integrity, and civil rights reached critical mass in this country. The room shifted, stiffened. Journalists scribbled faster. Committee members exchanged glances. But Owens didn't look shaken. Not yet. She leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other with casual defiance and raised her eyebrows. "So what?" she said, chuckling under her breath. "I earned that. I'm not some puppet. People pay because they believe in what I say. I've got reach. I've got followers. That's what value looks like in the free market." Her voice curled like smoke, aimed not at the committee, but at the camera. Always the camera. She didn't flinch. She thrived in controversy. She assumed this would pass, like every headline before. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She simply raised one hand. No words, just a crisp, deliberate snap of her fingers. The screen behind her burst to life again, and this time, it didn't show numbers. It showed names, dozens of them. BioTruth Collective, Eagle Justice Network, Liberty Path Fund, Free Nation PAC. Each name was flanked by damning footnotes, redacted security briefings, leaked memos, foreign financial ties, propaganda markers. Then came the arrows, red crisscrossing lines connecting each group to incendiary campaigns Owens had fronted. The vaccine lie, the BLM scam, Patriot Uprising, the truth about John 6. The screen pulsed like a map of a war zone, because that's what it was. The oxygen left the room. Crockett's voice didn't rise, but it cut cleaner than ever. "These aren't fan clubs," she said evenly. "They're information laundering machines. Many of them operate out of think tanks with shell fronts, untraceable donors, and back-end links to offshore interests flagged by cybersecurity analysts and DHS task forces. They don't pay you because they believe you, Ms. Owens. They pay you because you're useful." Then she turned to Candace, fully for the first time. "You're not an independent voice. You're an asset, deniable, disposable, but highly effective, until now." Owens's smirk faltered. Barely, but it was enough. Her lawyer shifted in his seat. Aides scribbled something urgent on paper. Across the country, in airports and bars and break rooms, Americans watching paused mid-sip. It was no longer a debate about opinion. It was a deconstruction of a machine, and the woman who stood at its center, cloaked in martyrdom but funded by shadows. And Jasmine Crockett had just pulled the first thread loose. The money trail was damning, but Jasmine Crockett knew it wasn't enough to just expose how the machine was built. She had to show where it bled. A sharp tap echoed as Crockett pressed a button embedded in the panel before her. The lights dimmed again, not theatrically, but surgically, like an operating room preparing for incision. The screen behind her reanimated, this time pulsing with a map of the United States bathed in heat signatures, shifting from pale yellow to deep crimson. Across the digital landscape, glowing clusters throbbed in cities, counties, and rural outposts alike, each one representing a concentration of viewer engagement with Candace Owens's most inflammatory content. At first, it looked like a simple analytics presentation, but as Crockett walked down from her chair and stepped to the floor, laser pointer in hand, the second layer slid into place, a transparent overlay of FBI-verified hate crime surges pinned to the same regions. The audience inhaled collectively. Cities like Tulsa, Orlando, Kenosha, and Mobile burned redder than the rest, not with heat, but with anger, fear, and real-world violence. Crockett stood centered in front of the map, the glow of data flickering across her face like a battlefield hologram. Her voice was low, measured, not theatrical, but lethal in its clarity. "What you're seeing," she began, "is not coincidence. It's correlation. This is the digital residue of weaponized speech." She tapped the pointer once, zooming into Arkansas. "On April 12th, your video titled 'The Race Card is Dead' surged to 2.3 million views in 48 hours. Another tap. On April 15th, a Black-owned bookstore in Little Rock was defaced with racial slurs and its windows smashed in. The screen split. Owens's video thumbnail on the left, news footage of the vandalism on the right. The timestamp alignment was surgical. "You didn't throw that brick," Crockett said, turning slowly to face Owens, "but you handed someone the weight and told them where to aim." She didn't need to yell. She didn't need theatrics. The data was a scalpel, not a hammer. "Ms. Owens," she continued, gesturing toward the growing timeline unfolding across the screen, "these aren't fringe events. These are repeated spikes in violence, always within 72 hours of your content going viral in specific counties." Now a third layer slid into view, geo-targeted social media trend lines, showing the echo chambers where Owens's language morphed into rage-fueled calls to action. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was causality, visible, traceable, bleeding from screen to street. Crockett returned to her seat slowly, letting the silence harden like concrete. Then she looked up, voice cool as glass. "You don't just speak to millions. You saturate them with fear, with suspicion, with license to act." The final image froze on screen, a side-by-side of Owens's YouTube dashboard, glowing green with monetized views, and a police body cam still of a young Latino boy, bloodied after being attacked by men screaming slogans pulled word for word from one of her live streams. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't need to. The room didn't breathe. Because for the first time, they weren't looking at influence. They were staring directly at impact. The chamber sat suspended in silence, the screen still burning with data and faces that couldn't be erased. And for the first time since the hearing began, the woman at the center of it all began to crack. Candace Owens shifted in her seat, but this time it wasn't performative. It was nervous. Her fingers tapped the side of her chair in a staccato rhythm, betraying the crackling current under her skin. The smirk that had carried her through countless interviews, debates, and viral standoffs had vanished, replaced by something harder to name. Anger, yes, but laced with uncertainty. "That's anecdotal," she snapped, her voice louder than necessary, too sharp, too fast. "That's not how algorithms work. You can't connect hate crimes to engagement spikes. That's not science." She looked around, eyes darting, not toward Crockett, but toward the press gallery, the cameras, the shadowed faces in the observation rows. "I don't control who watches my content. No one does. It's random. It's chaos. It's math. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough to make everyone in the room feel the tremor. Crockett didn't respond. She didn't need to. The data was still glowing on the screen behind her, cold and merciless. View counts layered over emergency room admissions. Comments like, "We're taking the country back," aligned to timestamps of racial assaults. Owens's outburst was a wall thrown up too late, and everyone watching knew it. Her tone was no longer that of the fearless provocateur. It was the voice of someone cornered by receipts, of someone who thought they were playing a game of narratives, but had wandered into a battlefield of numbers and consequences. And for the first time, the empire of certainty she'd wrapped around herself began to tremble. The data had cornered her, the maps had shaken her, but it was the voice from behind her own walls that would deal the deepest cut. And Crockett, calm as ever, had been saving him like a loaded chamber. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't announce anything with drama or flair. Instead, she looked down briefly at a single line in her notes, then lifted her eyes and said with quiet finality, "Madam Chair calls Mr. Aidan Keller to testify." The name meant nothing to most in the room, until the side door creaked open and a slender man stepped in, shoulders tight, jaw locked, and eyes blinking against the flood of flash bulbs and whispers that erupted like gas through dry air. He moved toward the witness chair with the careful steps of someone walking back into a fire they once escaped. But Jasmine's tone was unshaken, mercilessly precise. Former lead video editor for Owens Media Group, employed from 2019 to 2024, under direct contract. The color drained from Candace Owens's face. She didn't blink, but her lips parted ever so slightly as if she had just tasted poison. Keller adjusted the microphone, his hand trembling once, then still. "I came here because I couldn't keep pretending," he said, his voice low but unmistakably clear. "We weren't telling stories. We were building emotional weapons." Gas rippled again, but he continued without hesitation. Every video was tailored to ignite something specific: fear, rage, tribalism. We were told to find the quote that would divide, trim away any context that humanized the subject, and amplify only the tension. The truth wasn't the goal. Engagement was. He paused, locking eyes with no one in particular. And yes, that came from the top. The room froze. Journalists stopped typing. Staffers stopped whispering. For the first time, Candace Owens didn't just look challenged, she looked cornered. Behind Jasmine Crockett, the screens roared back to life, not with bullet points, but with damning proof. Internal Owens Media emails marked for final cut, filled with phrases like boost outrage cadence, cut for emotion over logic, delay fact-check overlay until after viral window. They weren't editing for clarity. They were editing for combustion. Jasmine said nothing. She simply folded her hands and waited. The silence was more ruthless than 1,000 accusations. Finally, Owens turned her head slightly, not to defend, not to rebut, but to glare sideways at the man she had once paid to sharpen her voice. Her lips barely moved, but those closest could hear the venom slip through clenched teeth. "You coward!" It wasn't the shout of someone defiant, it was the whisper of someone betrayed, exposed, and slowly drowning in her own reflection. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They just watched, as if witnessing a dam crack from the inside. The first fracture audible before the whole thing collapses. Candace Owens had entered the hearing cloaked in armor, but now it was clear. The breach wasn't from her enemies. It had come from within. The testimony had punctured her defenses, but what came next didn't come from a witness or a document. It came from her own mouth, captured in a moment she never expected to face in a courtroom built for truth. Without a word, Jasmine Crockett tapped twice on her tablet. The lights dimmed slightly, not for effect but for control, as the central screen shifted to a black box with a single white title: Internal Staff Briefing, Owens Media Group, Confidential. Then audio. Raw. Undeniable. Candace's voice crackled into the chamber, off mic but crystal clear, the kind of audio that couldn't be denied because it carried not just her sound, but her intent. "Let's stop pretending people care about the facts," her voice said, casual and confident. They just want someone to yell what they're thinking. They want someone to punch for them, verbally. So we give them that. Laughter followed from somewhere off screen. Staffers, likely. Then Owens's voice again, firmer now. Truth doesn't go viral. Anger does. Doubt does. Rage does. People want to feel something, not think. They want someone to shout their fears back to them like gospel. She laughed again, low and cold. Truth is boring, but rage pays. The silence that followed was brutal. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of confirmation. That sickening pause when suspicion curdles into proof. Dozens of heads turned to Owens. She didn't move, not even an inch. Her shoulders were locked, eyes fixed forward, jaw visibly clenched. It was no longer a hearing. It was a mirror, and she was being forced to watch herself speak without filter, without script, without the armor of post-production spin. What she'd built her empire on, righteous defiance, was now echoing back at her as pure manipulation. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, deliberately, letting the tension stew until it saturated the air. She didn't speak right away. She let the final words of the recording float, rage pays, until they burned into the marble. Then with a tone that sliced through the silence, she locked eyes with Owens and said, You weren't delivering truth. You were engineering outrage. She stepped closer to the center of the floor, her voice never rising, but growing heavier with each word. You didn't offer facts. You offered adrenaline. You weren't broadcasting insight. You were trafficking in chaos. She turned slightly, addressing the room now, not just the witness. This wasn't commentary. It was emotional exploitation dressed in commentary skin. And the public? They weren't just your audience. They were your product. No one spoke. No one moved. The image of Candace Owens's face, frozen in the grainy footage, still hovered behind Crockett, smiling in a moment of unguarded honesty, now turned to national evidence. And in that moment, even Candace seemed to realize the war wasn't just over narrative anymore. It was over ownership of consequence. Crockett had exposed the lies, the money, the manipulation, but now she stepped into the one place Owens couldn't spin or deflect, the human aftermath. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice or slam a gavel. She simply stood, walked to the edge of the platform, and looked straight into the heart of the hearing room. Her voice, when it came, was low and unwavering. We've heard the numbers. We've seen the strategy. Now let's meet someone who lived the consequences. A quiet gasp fluttered through the gallery as the doors opened, and a woman stepped forward, mid-30s in worn navy blue scrubs, her hospital badge clipped to the collar like armor. Her name, Raina Timmons, an ICU nurse from Birmingham, Alabama. Her gait was careful, restrained, like someone who had learned to brace for impact even when entering silence. She took her seat beside the microphone, adjusted it with slow hands, and looked up, not at Crockett, not at Owens, but at the empty air in front of her, as if the moment she was about to relive still hung there. My name is Raina Timmons, she began, her voice delicate but sharp, each syllable clipped by memory. I've been a nurse for 11 years. I've held dying hands. I've comforted families through glass. She paused, swallowing. But I've never been spat on, not until last fall. Her hands clenched the sides of her chair as she continued, her breath shallow. A man came into our hospital. COVID positive, unvaccinated, aggressive. I tried to help. I approached with kindness. He looked me in the eye and said, You're one of them. You're lying. Candace said so. The air in the room turned heavy, pressing against every chest. I told him I was there to save him. He spit in my face, she whispered. He said, You're the problem. You're what's killing us. And as security dragged him out, he shouted, Candace Owens warned us about people like you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Crockett stood frozen, jaw set, while cameras captured every flicker of emotion washing over the room. The nurse turned toward Owens, not with anger, but with something worse, betrayal. You didn't hurt me with your hands, Raina said. You did it with your voice. You gave people permission to see me as an enemy. And I still go to work. I still treat them. but I carry that moment like a stain I can't wash off. She turned back to the mic, her voice now barely a whisper. What did I do to deserve that, Miss Owens? Was it because I believed in medicine? Or was it because I was a black woman in a hospital coat? Candace Owens didn't answer. She couldn't. Her face, once carved in confident defiance, had gone motionless. Only her hands moved, gripping the chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She stared down at the floor, eyes unblinking, her lips drawn into a thin line as if the room had started to close in around her. There was no comeback, no viral retort, no lighting to fix this in post. Just the echo of one woman's story, undeniable, unspinnable, and the silence of a nation beginning to understand that the real cost of disinformation isn't lost arguments. It's people like Raina Timmons. The testimony had drawn blood, and the human cost had shaken the room. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to stir sympathy. She was here to follow the money, and now the receipts were radioactive. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With a quiet flick of her finger across the tablet before her, she summoned a new screen that eclipsed every chart before it. The display filled with a high-resolution financial matrix, rows upon rows of international wire transfers, color-coded to indicate origin, volume, and recipient. Let's pivot to funding, she said evenly, but her words cut with the finality of a verdict. She stood, pointing with the stylus in her right hand. Between March 11th and August 4th of last year, Owens Media Group received a series of high-value deposits totaling $3.4 million. Her voice sharpened. What's particularly fascinating is where these payments came from. Two so-called think tanks, one based in Moscow, the other in Budapest, both routed through anonymous shell corporations with no digital footprint beyond encrypted landing pages and post office boxes. A collective tightening rippled through the chamber. Every set of eyes, from press to panelists to public attendees, snapped to the screen as Jasmine zoomed into two flagged transactions, each tied to institutions previously cited in European Union reports for propaganda dissemination and digital destabilization campaigns. Now, Crockett continued, walking slowly across the floor, these transactions occurred precisely 72 hours before Ms. Owens released a series of monetized videos titled The Ukraine Deception, NATO's Hidden Agenda, and the Great Lie of Eastern Sympathy. She turned back toward Owens. So I'll ask plainly, why were you receiving untraceable funds from foreign entities that specialize in information warfare, just before you publicly parroted their geopolitical narratives on American soil? Candace Owens froze. Not entirely, but enough for the room to feel it. The breath she took was shallow. Her tongue clicked softly as she formed the words, but the timing betrayed her. Those were donations, she said at last, her tone strained, far from her earlier swagger. Independent contributions. My platform is global. People send money all the time. I don't check every single source. Her voice cracked slightly. It's free speech. They support what I say. That doesn't mean I'm working for them. Crockett arched a single brow. No one said you were working for them. I said they're paying you. She clicked once more, and the screen split, one side showing a wire transfer time-stamped at 11:17 a.m. March 13th, the other playing Owens's video uploaded at 3:41 p.m. the same day, where she called Ukraine a deep state distraction designed to funnel U.S. taxpayer dollars into corrupt foreign hands. The room exhaled sharply, the collective tension breaking not in relief, but recognition. There was no theory left, just timestamps, just numbers, just choices made, money received, messages delivered. Candace's lips parted as if to reply, but nothing came. Her hand, once clenched around the chair arm, released slightly, fingers twitching. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was incriminating, and it stretched like a shadow over the hearing, long and cold. Jasmine Crockett didn't press. She didn't need to. She had done what no viral clip, no fact check, no opposition takedown could ever do. She had tethered words to motive, and motive to money. With her narrative unraveling and her composure cracking, Candace Owens stayed silent. But the man paid to speak for her tried one final maneuver, reaching not for truth, but for technicality. The lawyer rose stiffly, clearing his throat like someone buying time with air. His suit was impeccable, his expression strained, and his words landed not with conviction, but with the nervous polish of a man trying to shield his client from a tide already breaching the walls. "Madam Chair," he began, holding a thin folder like a talisman, "we object to the direction of this proceeding. Much of the evidence introduced today, including financial disclosures and third-party testimony, was not submitted in accordance with the expected pre-hearing disclosure requirements." He paused, scanning for sympathy that didn't exist. "Given these procedural concerns, we request a temporary recess for review and consultation. This hearing is no longer fact-finding, it's a hostile ambush." The chamber didn't gasp, didn't move, but something in the air changed. Less tension, more resignation. Even those who had once believed in Owens's media poise could now see the edges folding inward. Jasmine Crockett didn't respond right away. She took a breath, closed the binder in front of her with calm finality, and slowly stood. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, measured, surgical. She looked at the attorney not with scorn, but with the disinterest of someone who had already anticipated every defense before it left the mouth. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear," she said, her voice low but unshakably firm. "You don't need a calendar invite to recognize the truth." She took a step closer to the dais, not looming, not towering, just present, in a way that couldn't be denied. "This hearing is not theater. It's not a curated broadcast. It's not a safe space for scripted rebuttals and PR framing." Then, without a pause, she turned her full body toward the camera embedded above the chamber clock, a direct stare into the living rooms, phone screens, and office monitors of a nation watching. Her voice didn't rise, but its weight grew heavy. "This is Congress, not a talk show, and not a sanctuary for spin." Her words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The stillness that followed was sharper than applause. Owens's lawyer sank slowly back into his seat, and Owens herself, eyes still locked on the desk, didn't lift her head, because there was no break coming, no intermission. The lights were on, the cameras were live, and the script was no longer hers to control. The defense had collapsed, the courtroom was breathless, and Candace Owens, once untouchable behind a wall of microphones, was now caught between her own contradictions. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She simply let the truth speak in Owens's own voice. The room darkened just slightly. The overhead lights dimmed enough to let the monitors glow like the surface of a scalpel. On Crockett's signal, the screen behind her came to life, not with charts or accusations, but with something far more damning. "Owens," speaking Owens into submission. The image crackled into place. Candace Owens on a stage in Georgia, March 2021, flanked by American flags and a roaring crowd. Her voice rang out across the hearing chamber in a tone sharpened by certainty. "The COVID vaccine is a government-engineered bioweapon. You are not protecting yourself, you're submitting to control. They want your DNA, your compliance, your children." Before anyone could react, the image jumped. Same face, different set, months later. Owens now seated in a sleek podcast studio, calm, polished, sipping from a branded mug. "Of course I got the vaccine," she says with a laugh. "I'm not anti-science. I fly internationally twice a month. What, do you think I'm reckless?" A ripple of unease tore through the gallery. Crockett stood still, her arms at her sides, watching the screen with the patience of someone who had played this sequence in her mind 100 times. The screen split now. On one side, Owens railing against state-sponsored chemical warfare. On the other, the same voice citing a belief in modern medicine. There was no editorializing, no dramatic music, just her words. Two versions of the same woman, each making the other impossible to believe. Then came the second montage. The screen cut to black before fading into a sunlit park. Candace at the height of her influence during the 2020 unrest, holding a megaphone. Her face was thunderous, her tone explosive. "Black Lives Matter is a fraud. They exploit tragedy to build power. It's a mafia cloaked in morality. And if you're defending them, you're part of the con." The audience in the hearing chamber stirred, some visibly bristling, but Crockett said nothing. She only gestured, and the next clip rolled. This time it was 2021. A sit-down interview with a right-leaning outlet. Owens was more reflective, her voice softer. I marched for BLM in 2014. I believed. I chanted their slogans. I cried for Michael Brown. I wanted change. She paused on screen, her hands folded gently in her lap. But I got older. I saw things differently. That's what growth is. Back in the hearing chamber, there was no applause. No outburst. Only discomfort. Crockett could feel it. She let it settle. Every person watching, here or on live stream, was being made to confront the simple truth. Owens wasn't just inconsistent, she was transactional. Her opinions weren't beliefs, they were leverage points, shaped to the moment, contorted to fit the market. The final clip faded and the screen returned to black. Jasmine stepped forward into the center of the floor, her heels clicking with slow, deliberate gravity. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence tighten, a noose made of exposure. Then she turned, not to Owens, but to the American people watching through the lens of every camera pointed at the room. Free speech, she began, her voice unwavering, is not a weapon to be used against truth. It is not a hall pass for hypocrisy. It is not the right to deceive and walk away clean. She pivoted now, facing Owens directly for the first time in several minutes. When you say one thing in March and the opposite in July, that's not evolution, that's convenience. Her tone sharpened like flint against steel. When you call BLM a mafia on stage, but claim to have once marched for them on camera, you are not demonstrating depth. You are demonstrating contradiction, strategic contradiction. She stepped closer, now just feet from the witness table where Owens sat visibly rigid. People evolve, opinions shift, but what we've just witnessed is not change. It's marketing. It's pivot for profit. It's message trafficking based not on principle, but on audience metrics. Her voice dropped slightly, more intimate, more cutting. You didn't tell the truth. You sold what your viewers wanted to hear until it stopped being profitable. The weight of it settled like smoke. Owens didn't move. Her fingers trembled slightly against the rim of her water glass, still untouched since the montage began. Her jaw clenched, but no words came. What could she say? That both versions of her were valid? That contradiction was authenticity? Crockett had already closed that door and locked it. Then came the final line. Crockett stepped back, lifted her eyes once more to the gallery, then to the nation through the lens, and delivered it with the calm of a woman who had done the work. Free speech is not the right to lie and walk away. The words dropped like a final gavel, not shouted, not dramatized, but etched into the floor, the air, and the country's collective consciousness. For years, Candace Owens had played the system like a stage, but here, in this chamber, with the lights unfiltered and the footage uncut, the script had turned against her, and no clever edit could rewrite what had just been exposed. She had just been dismantled by her own contradictions, her words turned into weapons against her. But Jasmine Crockett had one final payload, and it wasn't on camera or in public record. It was private, and it was devastating. The screen flickered once more, the room dimming as if instinctively bracing for impact. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "The committee has received a series of encrypted internal messages extracted from a whistleblower within Owens Media Group, verified through third-party forensic analysts." She walked slowly toward the witness table, a single sheet of paper in hand, but it wasn't paper that mattered. It was what was printed on it. Behind her, the screen lit up again, now displaying a digital message log. The sender, c.owens@omg.tv. The recipient, a redacted internal contact. Timestamp, November 2nd, 2023. Subject, narrative strategy. And then the quote, "It didn't scream, it didn't need to." I can make people doubt anything. What they choose to do with that doubt afterward, that's not my responsibility. No emoji, no caveat, just calculated casual detachment. There was a moment, so brief it could have been missed, where the entire room stopped breathing. No one stirred. No one whispered. Even the cameramen froze behind their viewfinders, as if the silence itself was sacred. Because it wasn't just a quote, it was a confession, a blueprint, the architecture of her brand, laid bare in black and white. Owens had always danced on the edge of plausible deniability, but here it was, the admission that doubt wasn't a byproduct. It was the product. Jasmine Crockett stepped to the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the paper like it had weight. Then she looked up, directly at Owens, and read the line aloud again. Slowly, measured, final. I can make people doubt anything. What they choose to do with that doubt afterward, that's not my responsibility. She didn't editorialize, she didn't raise her voice. She simply let the words hang, like a guillotine suspended mid-drop. Candace Owens' face changed, not crumbling, but contracting. Her eyes blinked rapidly, her shoulders tensed, her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Color rose to her cheeks in a slow, irreversible flood, and her right hand gripped the table's edge as if she could will her body to remain still, to stop from trembling beneath the weight of her own arrogance finally unmasked. Crockett took a single step forward. Not your responsibility, she repeated, almost a whisper. Not when they storm a hospital. Not when they spit in the face of a nurse. Not when they torch a mural. Not when they point a gun and say, "She warned me." The air thickened with every syllable. You fed them suspicion like oxygen, and now you want to claim you're not responsible for the fire? Crockett's voice didn't tremble. It was low, controlled, devastating. And then came the rupture. Someone in the gallery let out an audible, "Oh my God." Another stood, snapping a photo of the screen. Then it began. The building hum of chaos, the sudden shift from stunned silence to full-on eruption. Gasps, murmurs, shouts. Phones lit up, cameras zoomed, reporters ran from the back rows to secure satellite feeds. One journalist from the BBC shouted into her mic in real time, "We are witnessing an extraordinary moment here in Washington." A producer from France 24 waved frantically at her cameraman to adjust the angle. Live feeds switched from the White House to the hearing room in under 15 seconds. Social media boiled over. Hashtags ignited. "Not my responsibility" began trending globally before Crockett even returned to her seat. Amid the commotion, Owens didn't move. Her gaze dropped from the screen to her lap, her chin quivering just once, imperceptibly to most, but not to Crockett. She saw it. She sensed it. That moment when bravado finally surrendered to gravity. Owens had survived 1,000 debates, 1,000,000 tweets, a dozen firestorms of her own making. But now, she was wordless. And the silence wasn't strength. It was surrender. Crockett, ever precise, waited for the noise to plateau before delivering her final blow in this segment. She stepped behind her desk, adjusted the mic with steady fingers, and looked once more. Not at Owens, but at the people behind her, at the cameras, at the world. "We are not here to police speech," she said. "We are here to protect the consequences of speech from being sold as entertainment." She let that sink in. Doubt is not neutral when it is weaponized. Misinformation is not harmless when monetized. And power, her voice dropped to a near whisper, is not innocent when it profits from chaos. She sat down. No mic drop, no posturing, just silence, the most honest sound left in the room. And as the feed was broadcast live on 5 continents, there was no longer any question of what Candace Owens had built. It wasn't a movement. It was a machine of doubt. And now it was coming apart piece by bloody piece, under the merciless light of congressional record. The eruption had passed, the screens faded to black, and all that remained was the quiet, the kind that presses against your ribs and doesn't let go. Now came the question that had waited beneath every receipt, every contradiction, every bruise. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat once more, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the solemnity of someone about to close a chapter that had taken years to write. Her heels made no sound now as she approached the witness table. Only the weight of her presence moved the air. In her hand, she held no folder, no evidence, no printed statement. She needed none. Everything had already been shown, heard, felt. She stopped exactly 1 pace from the table, her eyes fixed on Candace Owens. Eyes not full of rage, but of relentless clarity. Her voice, when it came, was steady, even gentle. But beneath that calm was a blade honed for the final cut. "I'm going to ask this only once more, Miss Owens," she said, letting the words breathe. "Do you take responsibility for what you've said, for what it caused, for the people who listened, who acted, who bled?" She didn't blink. She didn't move. The question hung in the air like a live wire, crackling in the silence. The room had no ceiling, no walls, no floor, just stillness. Every eye in the chamber turned to Owens, and for the first time, there was no camera she could turn to, no narrative she could hijack. It was just her and the reckoning she'd spent years outrunning. Her hands remained folded in her lap, knuckles white with pressure. She inhaled slowly, as if preparing to speak. But then, nothing, not a word. Her eyes locked on the edge of the table, unfocused. Her lips pressed together. A single muscle beneath her right eye twitched. But still, nothing. The silence grew. 10 seconds, then 20. A murmur started at the edges of the gallery, the kind born not from disrespect, but from the unbearable pressure of anticipation. Crockett didn't flinch. She stood like a monument, her presence the only sound in the room. At 30 seconds, a cameraman in the far aisle adjusted his lens and stepped back, as if to widen the shot for what everyone now realized was a moment history would record. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. 40 seconds. Owens blinked once. A shallow breath. Her jaw tensed and relaxed again. But still, no answer. At the 50-second mark, a rustle passed through the committee dais. Aides leaned forward. Microphones flickered to life. Chairwoman Ellis, seated 2 places down from Crockett, exchanged a glance with the Parliamentary Council. No one needed to confer. No one needed a vote tally. The room had already spoken. At exactly 1 minute and 4 seconds into the silence, Chairwoman Ellis leaned forward and tapped her gavel lightly, just once. "Let the record reflect," she said, her voice flat and final, "that the witness has declined to respond." The words landed like a lid being sealed on a coffin. Jasmine Crockett turned slowly, returning to her desk without drama, without flourish. She sat, opened her binder once more, and spoke not to the witness, but to the nation. "Let the record also reflect that silence in the face of consequence is not exoneration. It is acknowledgement." Behind her, the monitors lit up, not with footage this time, but with a simple white slide bearing the crest of the Oversight Committee. Below it, in block type, Resolution number 48-17B, Authorization for Expansion of Inquiry into Foreign Influence, Platform Monetization, and Public Harm. The room stirred again, this time with purpose. Phones buzzed, typing resumed. Cameramen adjusted lenses for exit shots. But no one looked at Owens. Not anymore. Because the story had shifted. The power had moved. And the silence she had once weaponized now sat around her shoulders like a closing fist. She sat alone, eyes fixed forward, hands motionless. The table before her was clean. The screen behind her was bare. But everything she had built, every fragment of certainty, every word sharpened into ideology, every fire she'd lit and walked away from, was now under oath, under scrutiny, under investigation. And no microphone in the world could speak on her behalf now. That minute of silence would live longer than any soundbite she'd ever shouted. The silence had spoken louder than any defense ever could. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to end this hearing with noise. She would end it with a line that would echo longer than a shout, and she knew exactly what it would be. She stood slowly, her posture unshaken, not a single page in her binder out of place. The screen behind her remained blank, the lights overhead warming back to their full brightness. But the atmosphere in the room stayed heavy, charged with something irreversible. Her eyes, calm but lit with conviction, scanned the room one last time, not as a victor surveying the aftermath of a battle, but as a truth-teller who had delivered the final word with restraint, not rage. Then, without fanfare, Jasmine Crockett spoke her closing line, the kind carved not from rhetoric, but from reality. "Truth does not need to shout," she said. Her voice was soft, but every syllable was crystalline. "It only needs to stand still and let the light find it." The room froze, not with tension, but with stillness, a reverent pause. No applause followed, nor should it. This wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. And in that moment, the line didn't just settle in the air, it took root. It wasn't spoken for Owens. It was spoken for the people beyond the hearing room, for the nurse still haunted by a patient's hate, for the viewers duped into paranoia, for the truth buried beneath noise. Then came the shift. Candace Owens slowly stood, her chair legs scraping against the hardwood like a warning bell. She didn't look back at the committee. She didn't glance at Crockett. Her face was stony, her expression locked somewhere between indignation and exhaustion. But her silence screamed the loudest. She gathered nothing. No notes, no folders, no defense. Everything she had walked in with had been reduced to footage, contradictions, and unanswered questions. As she moved toward the door, the hallway beyond came alive. The wall of cameras was waiting, hungry, relentless, blinding. Flash bulbs burst like lightning against storm glass. Dozens of microphones stretched toward her like a firing squad of wires and foam. "Ms. Owens, do you deny foreign funding?" someone shouted. "Did you knowingly mislead the public?" cried another. "Do you stand by your Ukraine statements? Are you cooperating with the next phase of the investigation? Do you regret what you said about nurses and BLM?" The questions collided, stacked, echoed, each one sharper than the last. Owens said nothing. She walked forward, her pace tight and clipped, her jaw clenched with mechanical control. For years, she had thrived in front of these very lenses, commanding the spotlight, bending questions to her frame, redirecting scrutiny into spectacle. But not today. The optics had changed. The lights didn't worship anymore. They interrogated. And the silence around her was no longer deference. It was indictment. Her team followed closely behind, eyes down, mouths closed. Her lead attorney whispered something to her left ear. She didn't respond. She didn't flinch. But the moment she crossed the threshold into the marble corridor, the momentum was no longer hers. Aides passed her hurriedly. Journalists paced beside her like sharks. Even the Capitol security detail, usually stoic, kept glancing toward her as if watching a building crack in real time. Across the globe, her exit streamed live. CNN's lower third read, "Owens silent as hearing ends in stunning turn." BBC World, "Owens faces congressional inquiry expansion." Al Jazeera, "Right-wing commentator crumbles under congressional fire." But she didn't stop. She couldn't, because every step she took outside that room wasn't an escape. It was a retreat through broken glass. Back inside, Crockett remained seated, quietly collecting her notes, untouched by the chaos erupting outside. Her face bore no pride, only resolve. She had not aimed to humiliate. She had aimed to reveal. And she had. Not just the contradictions in Owens's narrative, but the frailty of an entire ecosystem built on manipulated outrage, paid provocation, and deniability for sale. There were no arrests that day, no handcuffs, no pounding of fists. But something far greater had occurred. Credibility had cracked in real time. And once trust breaks, especially under lights in front of millions, it cannot be reassembled with spin. Not even by someone as practiced as Candace Owens. Because this was no longer about a single figure. It was about a machine. And the moment the nation realized that the machine had a manual, had a motive, and above all had a maker who refused to answer for it, that machine didn't collapse all at once. But as Candace Owens vanished into the swarm of unanswered questions and unyielding cameras, its shell splintered, publicly, painfully, permanently. And though the hearing adjourned, the real work had just begun. The story wasn't over, but the empire of deception had cracked, and the light had found its way in. As the doors closed behind Candace Owens, and the glare of the cameras dimmed into distant echoes, the room was left not just with silence, but with something more permanent, the moral residue of what had just unfolded, and a lesson written not in law, but in consequence. There are moments in history when truth arrives not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet reckoning, slow, patient, irreversible. This was one of those moments, and within that chamber, where numbers had been wielded like blades, video had been stripped of its edits, and silence had screamed louder than sound. Something deeper than politics had been revealed. The world had just witnessed what happens when influence is mistaken for integrity, when a platform becomes a weapon, and when free speech is used not to liberate, but to manipulate. Jasmine Crockett hadn't won a debate. She had exposed a system, and not with fury, but with evidence. Not by shouting over noise, but by forcing noise to face the mirror. In doing so, she laid bare a lesson that had nothing to do with partisanship and everything to do with responsibility. That words are not without gravity. They land, they linger, and sometimes they destroy. But the human lesson didn't belong to the committee. It belonged to the people who had suffered in silence long before cameras were ever turned on. It belonged to the nurse who still woke at night with spit on her cheek and fear in her gut. It belonged to the teachers, doctors, frontline workers, immigrants, and black citizens who had been turned into targets by manufactured doubt. It belonged to the audiences who had been fed fear disguised as clarity, anger sold as empowerment. The hearing had revealed not only that misinformation had been monetized, but that its collateral damage had faces, names, and pain that didn't fit into trending hashtags. And the lesson wasn't just that Owens had gone too far. It was that she had been allowed to, until truth caught up. The moment forced a confrontation that America had long avoided, the difference between speech that challenges and speech that corrodes. Freedom of expression is a pillar of democracy, but it is not armor for deception. It is not immunity for malice. Crockett's line, "Truth does not need to shout," was more than a mic drop. It was a philosophy, one that declared that honesty does not require an audience to be valid, that decency does not need virality to have value, that real courage lies not in saying the most outrageous thing, but in standing accountable when the consequences come. For Candace Owens, the fallout wasn't just reputational, it was existential. Because when the applause fades, when the clicks dry up, when the brand loses its shine, all that's left is the ledger of what your voice truly built. And in her case, it wasn't community, it wasn't clarity, it wasn't truth. It was a scaffold of suspicion. It was a pipeline of chaos, disguised as commentary, protected by ambiguity, until someone like Crockett, armed only with facts and moral force, shattered the illusion. But the greater moral arc didn't end with her. It was about what we, as a society, permit when charisma overrides consequence. It was about what happens when doubt is industrialized, when platforms reward provocation over integrity, when entire ecosystems flourish by making people fear each other more than they understand each other. The hearing didn't just dismantle one narrative. It held up a mirror to the culture that allowed it to thrive. It reminded everyone watching that democracy cannot survive on spectacle alone. It requires truth. It demands it. And when truth is treated like an option instead of a foundation, even the loudest voices will eventually collapse under the silence of their own accountability. That day, as Jasmine Crockett packed her files and walked out without a press scrum, there was no headline screaming her name, no viral reel capturing her smile. But there was something else, the feeling, felt by millions, that honesty had finally stood up in a room that had long been under spin. And in that standing, a new standard had been drawn, not just for politicians or pundits or media moguls, but for all of us. The lesson was searing, simple, and non-negotiable. Influence without conscience is a loaded weapon, and silence in the face of consequence is its trigger. Truth may not trend, it may not sell, but it endures. And when spoken quietly under oath, in the face of power, it can bring even the loudest empire to its knees. As the gavel echoed its final strike, and the screens across America slowly dimmed, what lingered wasn't just scandal, it was a challenge, an open wound in the fabric of public truth that demanded more than observation. It demanded action. This wasn't a story that ended with a verdict. It began with a responsibility. Because every clip that went viral, every falsehood amplified, every truth buried beneath the noise wasn't just a byproduct of one woman's empire. It was the result of a system we all helped build, or at least allowed to grow unchecked. And now, as the dust settled in that Capitol hearing room, a larger question loomed like smoke in the rafters. What will you do with the truth now that it's no longer hidden? The time for spectatorship is over. Silence is no longer neutral. Every like, every share, every passively consumed soundbite is a vote, not just for content, but for the kind of country we allow to exist. We are not powerless in the face of misinformation. We are complicit if we remain passive. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose Candace Owens. She exposed how easy it is to turn rage into currency and how rarely we demand a receipt. But accountability cannot live in one courtroom or one hearing. It lives in every classroom, every platform, every conversation around the dinner table. If you're tired of being misled, if you've watched your community torn by false narratives, if you've lost someone to conspiracy before you lost them to illness, then this moment is yours too. You cannot change the algorithm, but you can change what you amplify. Refuse to share content that weaponizes identity and labels it truth. Demand transparency from every influencer, anchor, and elected official. Push for legislation that separates opinion from deception and holds purveyors of lies financially liable, not to stifle speech, but to stop weaponized distortion from parading as journalism. Fund media literacy in schools not as a luxury, but as a civic defense system. Make critical thinking louder than outrage. And most of all, vote. Not just in elections, but every day, with your clicks, your comments, your courage. The danger wasn't just Candace Owens. It was the vacuum of accountability around her. A vacuum created by platforms that reward engagement over ethics, by viewers addicted to confirmation, by lawmakers too afraid to lose followers to tell uncomfortable truths. That vacuum can only be filled by people who choose vigilance over convenience. If the line between speech and harm has been blurred, then it's up to us to redraw it, with action, with policy, and with personal conviction. This moment isn't about politics, it's about public safety. It's about choosing whether we want a society governed by data and deliberation, or by dopamine and division. Candace didn't invent outrage culture, but she mastered it. And in doing so, she reminded us of something dangerous. Truth dies not with a gunshot, but with a shrug. If we let falsehood fester because it's entertaining, if we excuse cruelty because it's clever, if we dismiss fact-checking as bias, we don't just lose the argument, we lose the republic. Now we stand at the edge of a different kind of war, not with bombs, but with bandwidth, not with armies, but with audiences. And in this battle, apathy is surrender. You don't need a podium to speak truth. You just need to stop feeding the lie. Cancel subscriptions that amplify misinformation. Write to your representatives and demand stronger protections against data manipulation and AI-enhanced disinformation campaigns. And yes, hold tech companies accountable for monetizing division. This hearing may be over, but your role in this isn't. Because there's a Candace in every feed, every algorithm, every whisper that turns into violence. She is not the last, but she can be the warning. Let her downfall serve as a blueprint, not for revenge, but for reconstruction. Let Crockett's quiet storm be a call, not for censorship, but for consequence. In the final analysis, this isn't about one woman's hypocrisy. It's about the price we all pay when we treat truth like an accessory instead of a foundation. If you felt the weight of that nurse's tears, the shiver in the silence that followed Crockett's question, the fury buried beneath those manipulated views, then you already know we can't afford to wait for another hearing. We are already the jury. So act, speak, investigate, question. Because truth doesn't just need defenders, it needs witnesses brave enough to stay awake when the spectacle fades. And in this era of engineered division, that may be the most radical form of patriotism left. But even as sweeping legislation and institutional reforms are debated, there's a quieter battlefield, one inside each of us. In a world saturated with curated outrage and algorithm-driven truth, the power to resist begins with something deceptively simple: self-awareness. Every time we click without questioning, every time we forward a headline without reading beyond it, we become unwitting cogs in the machine we claim to oppose. This is not a call for silence. It's a call for precision, to pause before we post, to ask, is this true, before we share, To recognize that freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence, and that amplifying harm, even unintentionally, still leaves fingerprints. The lies don't spread themselves. They are carried, pixel by pixel, by us. Jasmine Crockett's confrontation wasn't just about Candace Owens. It was a mirror, held up to a country that has, for too long, confused volume with truth, popularity with credibility. If we want to dismantle the empire of distortion, we don't just need hearings, we need habits. The kind that start in quiet moments when no one is watching, but truth is still at stake. Because in the end, democracy doesn't die in darkness. It dies in distraction. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.